finances, implementing the Council's charcoal ban, and preventing the resurgence of piracy of Somalia's coast. On 11th October 2024, the subject of the committee's informal consultations was a final report of the panel of experts and the 18 recommendations contained therein, of which 15 are currently under consideration by the committee. In its presentation, the panel covered topics such as weapons and ammunition management in Somalia, Al-Shabaab's finances and use of improvised explosive devices, IEDs, in complex and asymmetrical attacks, the activities of ISIL Somalia in Puntland, piracy of Somalia's coast, humanitarian as well as international humanitarian law issues, and the implementation of runoff exemption to the Council's charcoal ban. On 6 February 2024, the committee issued its fourth implementation assistance notice, which is entitled Guidance to Member States on the application of the humanitarian exemption established by the Resolution 2664 to the asset freeze established under Resolution 1844. On 21st May 2024, the committee approved the addition of 3 individuals to its sanctions list. During the reporting period, the committee received 2 notifications pursuant to paragraph 19B of Resolution 2713 related to the restrictions on components that may be used in the manufacture of IEDs. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ambassador Yamazaki for his briefing. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is therefore adjourned. The 9,769th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is, and I quote, threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following to participate in this meeting. Mr. Adedij Ebo, Director and Deputy to the High Representative of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, and Mr. George Samwali, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. And I now give the floor to Mr. Adedij Ebo. You have the floor.
Madam President, I am providing this briefing on behalf of the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu. The Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launched on 24 February 2022, in violation of the UN Charter and of international law, continues to inflict large-scale suffering on the people of Ukraine. As we approach the tragic milestone of 1,000 days since the start of the invasion, we continue to witness unimaginable levels of civilian deaths and injuries, with escalating Russian attacks reported across the country. it is worth repeating. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are unacceptable. Indiscriminate attacks are prohibited under international law. All parties to any conflict have an obligation to respect and protect civilians, as well as to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Madam President, transfers of arms and ammunition and the provision of other forms of military assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine have continued. Information from various governments regarding these transfers is accessible through open sources. The transfers have reportedly included heavy conventional weapons such as battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircraft, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions and small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. There have also been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons such as uncrewed aerial vehicles, ballistic missiles, and ammunition to the Russian armed forces, and that those weapons have been used and are likely to be used in Ukraine. Recent reports also refer to the presence of third-party military personnel in the Russian Federation to assist in military operations against Ukrainian forces. We urge all concerned to refrain from any steps that may lead to further spillover and intensification of the war. I reiterate that any transfer of weapons and ammunition must take place consistently with the applicable international legal framework, including, of course, relevant Security Council resolutions, which in certain instances impose sanctions and restrictive measures on such transfers. Reported use and transfer of cluster munitions are deeply concerning in the light of the indiscriminate effect that these weapons have, combined with the widespread contamination they cause. The universal participation in and the full implementation of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines and on their destruction, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons must remain a priority. Humanitarian imperatives have long driven disarmament efforts. I call on all states to abide by their international humanitarian law obligations and to become parties as a matter of priority to disarmament treaties and comply with the obligations therein. Compliance with these obligations is crucial in preventing unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury to persons and in protecting civilians. It is in times of heightened tensions and insecurities that we should reaffirm our commitment to humanitarian disarmament and preserve global efforts to protect civilians. Madam President, the transfer of weapons and ammunition into any armed conflict carries the risk of diversion and, by extension, raises serious doubts, serious escalation concerns. Measures to prevent and mitigate the risk of diversion of weapons and ammunition are key for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Such efforts by all parties involved in arms transfers will also be essential to post-conflict recovery. Importing, producing, exporting, and transit states must act responsibly at every step along the arms and ammunition transfer chain to prevent and detect diversion, illicit trafficking, and misuse. Pre-transfer risk assessments, marking, and record-keeping practices, as well as tracing and investigation capabilities are of utmost importance. Effective physical security and stockpile management of arms and ammunition, as well as customs and border control measures, are also key. To prevent the diversion of conventional arms and regulate the international arms trade, states have also established a number of arms control treaties and instruments. This includes the Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, and its International Tracing Instrument, and the Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management. Universal participation in the relevant treaties, as well as full and effective implementation of these treaties and instruments, must remain a priority. Madam President, between 24 February 2022 and 30 September 2024, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded over 11,973 civilians killed and more than 25,943 civilians injured in Ukraine. According to the OHCHR, September was the month with the highest number of civilians casualties in 2024, continuing a trend of higher civilian casualties that started in July. The use of uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles by the Russian Federation continues to cause civilian deaths and injuries, as well as damage to civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. In addition, there have also been reports of a number of cross-border strikes using missiles and uncrewed aerial vehicles by Ukraine inside the Russian Federation, with some resulting in civilian casualties and damage to civilian objects. Just like any other weapon or weapon systems, armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles must not be used in a manner inconsistent with international humanitarian law. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas remains one of the most significant threats to civilians in armed conflict. Such use of these weapons is unacceptable in view of the pattern of civilian harm and the likelihood of indiscriminate effects. I reiterate the Secretary General's call for states to reduce the human cost of weapons by endorsing the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, if they have not already done so. Madam President, I wish to reiterate the United Nations' support for all meaningful efforts to bring a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with international law, including the UN Charter and relevant General Assembly resolutions. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. George Samueli.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to address this distinguished body. If ever a war could easily have been avoided, the war in Ukraine is that war. If ever a war was needlessly provoked, the war in Ukraine is that war. The war in Ukraine came about as a result of the Western powers' single-minded insistence on scooping up every single country on the European continent into NATO and on expanding the borders of NATO right up to the borders of the Russian Federation. The war in Ukraine came about because the Western powers, for more than 3 decades, continued to dismiss the innumerable pleas of successive Soviet and Russian leaders, including Mikhail Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, and Vladimir Putin, that there can be no security for anyone unless the West and Russia agree on a common framework for peace that guarantees the freedom and security for all. How do we know this? Because former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg told us as much. In September 2023, Stoltenberg went before the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee and explained very succinctly that the war in Ukraine could have been avoided had NATO not insisted on moving its military infrastructure up to Russia's borders. President Putin, he explained, had, quote, actually sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. He wanted us to sign that promise never to enlarge NATO. We rejected that, so he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO, close to his borders. He got the exact opposite. What Stoltenberg was referring to here were the two draft proposals for a new security architecture for Europe that Russia had issued on December the 17th, 2021. The proposals, one addressed to NATO, one addressed to the United States, recalled the framework of the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, in which the mutually antagonistic parties of the Cold War agreed to recognize one another's security concerns and pledged not to enhance their own security at the expense of that of their purported adversaries. At the heart of Russia's proposals was a commitment by NATO to no further expansion, and in particular, to no NATO membership for Ukraine. There was nothing so extraordinary about that. In its 1990 Declaration of State Sovereignty, Ukraine had declared, quote, its intention of becoming a permanently neutral state that does not participate in military blocs. The notion propagated by NATO spokesmen and Western policymakers that every state has the sovereign right to join any military alliance it wants, to deploy whatever armaments it wants on its territory, and to ignore the security concerns of its neighbors, flies in the face of innumerable international treaties and covenants, not to mention the international practice of states since time immemorial. The Helsinki Final Act of 1975 spoke of the indivisibility of security. The 1990 Charter of Paris for a New Europe declared security is indivisible and the security of every participating state is inseparably linked to that of all the others. The OSCE's 1999 Istanbul document repeatedly returns to the theme of what it called, quote, the concept of common, comprehensive, and indivisible security, and a common security space free of dividing lines. And let's not forget, of course, that in October 1962, the United States did not accept the argument that the island of Cuba had the sovereign right to station on its territory whatever weapon systems it felt it needed for its security. However, the security the Western powers demand for themselves, they refuse to extend to others, particularly to the Russian Federation. The Cold War came to an end in 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved the Warsaw Pact, then dissolved itself, then abandoned the communist ideology that had once generated so much fear and suspicion in the West. Russia wanted nothing more than to be left in peace to rebuild its shattered economy. Recall Russian President Boris Yeltsin's words before the joint session of the US Congress on June the 17th, 1992. Quote, today the freedom of America is being upheld in Russia. The idol of communism, which spread everywhere social strife, animosity, and unparalleled brutality, has collapsed. It has collapsed, never to rise again. I am here to assure you we will not let it rise again in our land. What had taken place at that time was unprecedented in human history. Soviet and Russian leaders gave up territory, gave up military allies, and sacrificed security. Recall, they did not have to do this. The Soviet Union had lost no war. To the contrary, the Soviet Union was still a formidable military and political force, inspiring fear and respect throughout the world. Soviet and Russian leaders did what they did because they believed it to be the right thing to do. Yet Western leaders interpreted the end of the Cold War as a victory for the West and a humiliating defeat for the Soviet Union. According to former President George H.W. Bush, the Soviet Union did not simply lose the Cold War, the Western democracies won it. And as the supposed victors, the Western powers immediately set about scooping up their winnings. They proceeded to contain, surround, and encircle Russia, so that Russia would never again be a great power. Most shocking of all, especially to the Russians, was the speed with which the West did all of this. Let's recall US Secretary of State James Baker's words to Mikhail Gorbachev in Moscow on February the 9th, 1990. The Berlin Wall had fallen only 3 months earlier, yet the United States was already pushing for a united Germany inside NATO. To get Gorbachev to agree to this, Baker pledged that NATO would not move, quote, 1 inch to the east. Subsequently, Western politicians claimed that Baker was referring only to the territory of East Germany, not to the countries of Eastern Europe. But this is a thoroughly disingenuous claim. At the time of Baker's meeting with Gorbachev, the Warsaw Pact was still in existence. And since the countries of the Warsaw Pact were all to the east of Germany, the words, not 1 inch to the east, would have had to be referring to them. From that moment, in February 1990, Western leaders were to give Russian leaders repeated assurances that there would be no NATO expansion, only to walk back those assurances the moment they had secured whatever concessions they were seeking from Moscow. Former UK Prime Minister John Major, for example, declared in March 1991 that he, quote, does not foresee conditions currently or in the future under which East European countries could be in NATO. Then there was former NATO Secretary General Manfred Wörner, who, after having assured a visiting Russian delegation that neither he nor anyone else in NATO was interested in NATO enlargement, was by March 1993 pressing then US Secretary of State Warren Christopher to, quote, start considering possible timeframes, candidates, and criteria for membership expansion. Madam President, esteemed representatives, once the Western powers embarked on NATO expansion, things moved with extraordinary speed. All that was needed was to tell the Russians that what was actually happening wasn't really happening, that it was all a figment of their imagination. For example, President Bill Clinton, after assuring President Yeltsin that the Partnership for Peace program was an alternative to NATO enlargement and not a preliminary step towards it, immediately went back on his word. In January 1994, in Prague, Clinton declared that yes, Partnership for Peace was indeed the first step towards NATO membership. Partnership for Peace, he said, quote, is not a permanent holding room. It changes the entire NATO dialogue so that now the question is no longer whether NATO will take on new members, but when and how. Moreover, even at that early moment, Clinton was already indicating that the eventual goal was Ukraine's induction into NATO. In a July 1995 memo written for President Clinton, then National Security Advisor Anthony Lake boasted that the US intended to ride roughshod over the qualms of some Europeans that NATO enlargement was moving too quickly. Lake boasted, quote, some allies reacted to Russian criticisms of enlargement by suggesting that the alliance slow the process. We successfully insisted NATO stick to the timetable. Yet in public, US and NATO leaders were saying something different, something that was manifestly untrue, namely that NATO expansion was all about ending divisions and bringing stability to Europe. For example, in 1994, Secretary of State Warren Christopher declared, quote, the expansion of NATO will advance America's fundamental goal, a peaceful, undivided, and democratic Europe. NATO enlargement will enhance stability, reduce tensions, and prevent new dividing lines in Europe. US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright proclaimed in February 1997, quote, NATO has helped bring within our grasp the most elusive dream of this century, an undivided Europe at peace in which every nation is free and every free nation is a partner. For those not invited to join this year, but who wish to join, NATO's door must remain open. But how could there be stability? How could there be no new dividing lines in Europe if NATO expansion was to be directed toward exclusion of Russia? Russian leaders repeatedly expressed an interest in NATO membership. In a December 1991 letter to NATO leaders, written shortly after the Soviet Union's dissolution, Boris Yeltsin proposed exploring a framework for Russia's possible membership in NATO. In 1993, in conversations with US and European leaders, Yeltsin again raised the possibility of Russia's joining NATO. Yeltsin told NATO Secretary General Manfred Wörner that Russia might consider NATO membership if the alliance were to become a political organization rather than a military one. President Putin also spoke of Russia's interest in NATO membership. In March 2000, asked by BBC presenter Sir David Frost whether Russia could possibly join NATO, Putin replied, "I don't see why not. I would not rule out such a possibility if and when Russia's views are taken into account as those of an equal partner." Putin discussed possible NATO membership with President Clinton. Clinton reportedly responded, "I have no objection." Later on, Clinton told him, "You know, I've talked to my team. No, it's not possible now." NATO leaders showed not the slightest interest in exploring these offers of genuine partnership, genuine dissolution of barriers, and genuine frameworks for mutual security. That NATO expansion directed towards the exclusion of Russia, towards the containment and encirclement of Russia, would end in disaster was obvious to seasoned observers of international affairs. Renowned diplomat and historian George F. Kennan expressed his disgust at this mad rush towards NATO enlargement. "I think it's the beginning of a new Cold War," he warned in 1998. "I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else." An obvious question arises. What was behind this rush for NATO enlargement? What was the need for it? No one was threatening anybody else. To the contrary, relations between Russia and the West were unprecedented in their conviviality. Yeltsin cooperated with NATO and Yugoslavia, even working against the interests of Russia's traditional ally, the Serbs. This cooperation continued with Putin. Putin was the first foreign leader to call President Bush after the 9/11 terrorist attacks and proclaimed that Russia would become America's partner in the global war on terror. Putin permitted the United States to transit troops and weapons across Russian territory en route to Afghanistan. President Clinton has explained the rationale behind his push to expand NATO. Writing in an April 2022 edition of The Atlantic, Clinton explained that it was all about his fear of Russia's supposed, quote, return to ultranationalism, replacing democracy and cooperation with aspirations to empire like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. If Russia chose to revert to ultranationalist imperialism, fueled by natural resources and characterized by a strong authoritarian government with a powerful military, an enlarged NATO and a growing European Union would bolster the continent's security. So there we have it. Nothing here about ending divisions in Europe, about extending security throughout the European continent, and all those other grandiose declarations NATO leaders have regaled us with for the past 3 decades. It was all, as Russian leaders had suspected, all about containing and encircling Russia with a hostile military alliance. Madam President, esteemed representatives, over the years, Russian leaders have made their feelings plain, but their protests were repeatedly dismissed and ignored. In an interview with The Telegraph in 2008, former Soviet President Gorbachev said, quote, the Americans promised that NATO wouldn't move beyond the boundaries of Germany after the Cold War, but now half of Central and Eastern Europe are members. So what happened to their promises? President Yeltsin repeatedly expressed bafflement as to why NATO was expanding at breakneck speed to the east if NATO and Russia were supposed to be partners. In a November 1994 letter to Clinton, Yeltsin warned that the Russian people were increasingly seeing NATO expansion as, quote, the beginning of a new split in Europe. In December 1994, Yeltsin asked, quote, why sow the seeds of mistrust? After all, we are no longer enemies. In May 1995, in a one-on-one conversation at the Kremlin with Clinton, Yeltsin declared, I see nothing but humiliation for Russia if you proceed. How do you think it looks to us if one bloc continues to exist while the Warsaw Pact has been abolished. It's a new form of encirclement if the once surviving Cold War bloc expands right up to the borders of Russia. Moreover, Russian leaders were only too aware that NATO had long set its sights on eventual Ukraine membership. In March 1997, in Helsinki, Clinton disclosed to Yeltsin that, yes, the former republics of the USSR would indeed be joining NATO, and that would, of course, include Ukraine. From that moment, things moved quickly. May 1997 sees the opening of the official NATO Information and Documentation Center in Kiev. July 1997 sees the signing of a NATO-Ukraine Charter and the establishment of a NATO-Ukraine Commission. November 2002 sees the NATO-Ukraine Action Plan. In April 2005, President George W. Bush and then Ukraine President Viktor Yushchenko jointly declared, quote, the United States supports Ukraine's NATO aspirations and is prepared to help Ukraine achieve its goals. The United States supports an offer of an intensified dialogue on membership issues with Ukraine. April 2008, of course, sees the NATO announcement in Bucharest that Ukraine would be a member of NATO. And then, just to take matters up to the present day, we have US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin announced in October 2021 that the door to NATO membership for Ukraine was open. As to how the Russians were likely to view Ukraine's membership of NATO, there is no better source for this than the current CIA Director, William Burns. In 2008, as US Ambassador to Moscow, Burns wrote an email to US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in which he explained, quote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russia's interests. Madam President, esteemed representatives, that the current war in Ukraine was always about NATO expansion and not about seizure of territory was obvious from the arc of the peace negotiations that took place shortly after the start of the conflict, first in Minsk, then in Istanbul. In April 2022, in Istanbul, Russia and Ukraine reached and initialed an agreement, the most important part of which was that Ukraine would pledge to become a permanently neutral state. It would never join NATO or allow foreign military bases and contingents on its soil. Ukraine could, however, seek membership of the European Union. Crucially, however, Ukraine was not asked to forego its sovereign claims over Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk. Those matters were to be resolved in future discussions between the presidents of Russia and Ukraine. However, this eminently reasonable agreement that would have brought the war to an immediate end was not to the liking of key NATO leaders. Washington became alarmed that Ukraine was about to agree to this deal. According to the New York Times, US officials told their Ukrainian counterparts, quote, you understand this is unilateral disarmament, right? Finally, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson flew to Kiev and urged Zelensky to drop the idea. Putin was a war criminal, Johnson said. He should be crushed, not negotiated with. Even if Ukraine were ready to sign a deal, Johnson told him, the NATO powers were not. Following the collapse of the talks, Turkey's foreign minister declared, quote, there are those within the NATO member states that want the war to continue and Russia to get weaker. NATO's policy thus remains unchanged. Despite everything that has happened, despite the experience of the past 30 years, despite the obvious fact that the expansion up to Russia's borders has generated instability and war, despite all of that, what does NATO do? It continues to insist that Ukraine must and will be a member of NATO. In other words, the war must go on for the sake of a cause, Ukraine's membership of NATO, that guarantees war. NATO's leaders are like the Bourbons. They have learned nothing and forgotten nothing. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
I now give the floor to members of the Council who would like to make a statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we'd like to thank the representative of European civil society, George Samueli, for his sobering report about what's actually happening and what triggered the current conflict, a conflict that's not pitting Ukraine against Russia, but Russia and the West, that is Russia and the US and NATO. We can add to his report something that was uttered yesterday by the Slovakian Prime Minister, Robert Fico. In Europe, we no longer use the word peace. That word doesn't exist. Anyone who speaks of peace is seen as fueling war. Anyone who speaks of war is deemed to be fighting for peace. End of quote. This is the Orwellian reality in which Western states reside in today. They've decided to use the hands of the Kiev regime to inflict strategic defeat on Russia. But their plans are a fiasco. The head of the Kiev junta is concerned. He's concerned that him and his posse are going to be thrown under the bus, to put it simply. He's even blackmailing the world by saying that Ukraine might get a nuclear weapon. This is something we discussed in detail on the 21st of October. Yet our Western colleagues didn't say a word about that. Or sometimes the Kiev junta is getting involved in military escapades, for instance, the one in the Kursk region, where the Ukrainian army suffered losses of over 25,000 people, including its best-trained reserves. There are no effective plans, B, C, or otherwise, which could be used to change the catastrophic situation for the Ukrainian army. Neither Kiev, nor Washington, nor London, nor Brussels have such a plan, nor can they come up with one. It's clear that without the West's direct involvement in the war with a nuclear power, something that the past Ukrainian president ardently wants, the Ukrainian military will continue to retreat and sustain catastrophic losses. This is unequivocally supported by information from the front, where the Russian army is successfully and gradually leading its offensive campaign against key areas. This is something that cannot be denied even by Western military experts. According to their data, in October alone, we liberated 478 square kilometers. In October alone. By the end of the month, this was happening at a pace of 30 square kilometers a day. The Russian military, in just the last few days, liberated such large and strategically important settlements such as Gornyak, Selidova, Katerinovka, Dobrovolya, Bogeyevlenka, Izmailovka, Alexandropol, Shakhterskaya, and Vishnevaya. The counteroffensive that Ukraine led in 2023, and during that campaign, it got just 250 square kilometers, which we've since then liberated. So in 2023, as a whole, it seized 2 times less territory than we've managed to liberate per month. The Kiev authorities are working very hard to hide the truth from their people and their Western sponsors. As we learned yesterday, Ukrainian servicemen were ordered to use in their discussions with journalists the words victory, moving forward, pushing out the enemy, to use those, and not to use the words retreat or the enemy broke through our defenses. On top of that, the propaganda of the Kiev regime in these instances quickly deems cities it's lost as being ones without any strategic importance or heavily subsidized. Examples are Kurakhova, Kurahovskoye, Toretsk, Pokrovsk, and the remainder of the Donbas that remains in the Ukrainian armed forces' control. And yet, the West continues to supply the Kiev regime with military equipment, including military artillery systems, UAVs, and tanks, including to ensure that Western defense companies can make a quick penny and to use up their outdated or old military equipment. And the Kiev junta is also remembering to line its pockets. The Pentagon recently conducted an audit according to which $2.1 billion sent to Ukraine between January and to December 2022. That's the money that was audited. And it was found out that $1.1 billion were unaccounted for, undocumented. It's unclear how we can check those payments. As for the corruption that goes hand in hand with the deliveries of military equipment to Ukraine is something that journalists will look into later. And yet, already Washington and its allies are realizing that the Zelensky regime's problem lies not in the fact that it doesn't have enough weapons or ammunition. The main reason for the Ukrainian forces falling back on the front is the fact that the people no longer believe the ex-actor, which lost all legitimacy back in May. Zelensky campaigned using slogans about peace with Russia, equal rights for Russian speakers, protecting Orthodox Christianity. That's why people voted for him. However, subsequently, in order to please Western geopolitical interests, he chose the opposite path, turning his country into a pawn in the game against Russia, in the hope that with the US's help, Ukraine can become a queen on the chessboard. This is a treacherous past, treacherous vis-a-vis the Ukrainian people. And so Zelensky sold fertile land and strategic companies to Western corporations for a pittance. This process is ongoing. As we found out from the secret annex to the so-called Zelensky peace plan, Ukraine is ready to provide to the US the use of strategic resources in Ukraine: uranium, titanium, lithium, and graphite. These annexes are probably secret because, according to Article 13 of the Ukrainian constitution, the Ukrainian subsoil does not belong to the government. It belongs to the people of Ukraine. And giving away these resources to foreign companies would require a referendum as a bare minimum. I'd like to remind you that the US has already been eyeing up these deposits. Senator Lindsey Graham suggested that the US could provide assistance to Kiev in exchange for access to minerals, which he valued at 10 to 12 trillion US dollars. Selling off all of Ukraine's assets is something other sponsors of the Kiev regime are insisting on. A European Council decision on giving out loans against frozen Russian assets. In that document, there's a condition on the transfer to Brussels of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex assets. Recognizing that the current Ukrainian leader is acting in the best traditions of thieves, traitors, and against the people, hetmans, realizing that Ukrainians are turning away from Zelensky en masse. As a result, the Ukrainian army is experiencing a catastrophic lack of servicemen, and there are no more volunteers turning up at the draft offices. In order to solve this problem, the regime is using all sorts of tricks, inventing more and more sophisticated methods to get their hands on recruits. In order to plug holes in their front lines, young men are not only being grabbed in the streets, in public transport in small cities. In fact, the draft officers are lying in wait for them at concerts and restaurants in Kiev, places where young men used to be able to go without fearing being snatched by the draft office, and then a few days later, after some perfunctory training, ending up on the front lines. The hunt for men is very harsh. It is not regulated by any laws. According to information that's made it online, in Ukraine, as part of the forced mobilization, over 100 men have died at the hands of these draft officer polizais. No one's been detained, no one's been punished, and the information about these incidents has been hushed up. And yet, still, there is not enough cannon fodder on the front. At the behest of Kiev's backers, increasingly we're hearing calls to lower the draft age to 18 to 21 years old. In this context, many are hiding at home, dodging the draft, fleeing the country. Online, there are many videos showing Ukrainian men who've managed to cross the border, congratulating themselves on fleeing what they call Zelensky's concentration camp. Quite a few of them opt to go to Russia. Between February of 2022 and 2023, in that period alone, 5.3 million Ukrainian refugees arrived in the Russian Federation. Now there are many more on our soil. And yet Zelensky and his posse are incensed that those who've moved to the West, that these Ukrainians, when they encounter everyday problems, humiliation and discrimination based on the language they speak, not only decide to move to Russia, but they're actually moving to the very regions which joined our country following the referendums in the fall of 2022, and they're doing this en masse. Ukrainian men who haven't managed to flee, who are being sent to the front line forcibly, they've decided to surrender right away or to desert. According to the data from the Public Prosecutor's Office of the Ukraine, in the first 8 months of 2024, almost 30,000 cases were opened following incidents of soldiers going AWOL. Back in 2022, there were only 6,500 such cases. According to experts, in actual fact, the number of deserters runs into the hundreds of thousands, between 100,000 and 170,000. All of Ukraine is heatedly discussing what's happening, this free-for-all surrounding the mobilization process. And it is only Kiev's Western sponsors who are trying to turn a blind eye to this fatal trend, trying to convince the head of the Kiev regime to continue sending these poor souls to the front. Ukrainian soldiers who we've taken prisoner have said that in order to avoid demotivated Ukrainian recruits from fleeing right away, in the rear guard there are well-motivated nationalists and neo-Nazis who are basically anti-retreat forces, shooting them in the back if they try to flee. Another way of keeping up the fighting spirits in the Ukrainian army is pumping the army full of foreign mercenaries. Since we began the special military operation, at least 15,000 mercenaries from over 100 countries have arrived in Ukraine. Most of them have been liquidated, but private military companies from Poland and the US are trying to enlist more, trying to entice people to send their servicemen to Ukraine as cannon fodder. Specifically, the following private military companies are actively involved: Academy, Cubic, Dakos Benefits, Dean Corporation, Forward Observation Group, Hyperion Services, Sign of Liberty International, and the Polish private military companies ASBS Otago and European Security Academy. It is mercenaries and nationalists who stand behind the most notorious, the most chilling crimes and violations of international humanitarian law, including those committed by bandits and marauders when they invaded the Kursk region. We have incontrovertible evidence of the most serious crimes being committed by the Kiev regime vis-à-vis the civilians and civilian infrastructure in Russian cities. This is something we convincingly demonstrated at the Aria Formula meeting last week. The fact that Ukrainian soldiers shot at civilians in the Kursk region who were fleeing is something that even American journalists had to recognize just a few days ago. Madam President, without a doubt, none of the truth I've just told you will be repeated by Western colleagues today, just like we won't hear any comments from them regarding the countless violations by the Zelensky regime of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. They have been deliberately mining, Ukrainian units have been deliberately mining road shoulders, bridges, and territories surrounding residential buildings, hospitals, and educational institutions. They've been using the civilian population, mining them with anti-personnel mines called PETO, other traps, and mining the bodies of fallen civilians and servicemen. For instance, just a few days ago, a video appeared online in which a Ukrainian army soldier is stuffing explosives into a child's toy, saying that this toy will be sent to the Kursk region. Its hackneyed narrative is repeated by the West, and that's easier than assessing the facts, which show that the Ukrainian armed forces have been systematically using against the Russian armed forces and civilians toxic chemicals, which are scheduled in the Convention on Chemical Weapons, BZ, and chloropicrin as well. They've been using other agents, including right control agents. These facts are either hushed up or, as per the West's tradition, they're trying to accuse the Russian Federation of using these chemicals. On the 21st of October, the representative of Slovenia tried to lay the blame on Russia, the blame for using chemical substances, toxic substances, in the same river. He forgot that back on the 13th of September, in this very chamber, we warned against the potential release of toxic chemicals in the following rivers, the Seine and the Desna. And this could be done by a military-industrial complex company, Ukrainian one, in the Sumy region. Madam President, by way of conclusion, I recommend that our Western colleagues muster up their courage and recognize that the course they've chosen, fighting Russia using Ukrainian hands, is unjustified. The hopes of inflicting strategic defeat on our country and forecasts about the inevitable crash of our economy have not come to pass, no matter how much the UK representative tried to convince us of the opposite yesterday. The facts are very stubborn, and they show that the short-sighted policies pursued by Washington, London, and Brussels the economic and energy crisis have hit Western countries and their citizens the hardest, whereas the Russian Federation managed to withstand thousands of sanctions. Our economy is growing. Last year, it grew roughly 3.5%. This year, economic growth is estimated at 4%, 3.9%. And yet, the EU, the Eurozone economy is teetering on the brink of recession. We've heard that the world's Germany's biggest company, Volkswagen, plans to close at least 3 plants, to lay off tens of thousands of staff, and to enact a pay cut to the tune of 18% on the remainder of its staff. Siemens, in the meantime, said that investing in Germany is pointless, and the company will now only invest in broadening its capacity abroad. Attempts to isolate our country were proven to be in vain last week, when last week, in fact, in Kazan, we held the BRICS summit, attended by leaders from 36 countries and 6 international organizations. They are the drivers of a process for finding just, sustainable, and lasting peace to the Ukrainian crisis, based on respect for the UN Charter in full, not just the bits about territorial integrity. They also call for the resolution of its root causes, coming up with lasting and equal security formula, which take into account the interests of all global players. This is a serious approach. It's not just some attempt to impose ultimatums on Russia, something that's divorced from reality. I'd like to warn you that we cannot have a repeat of the scenario with the Minsk agreement. We can't simply freeze the front so that the Zelensky regime can lick its wounds, just like we won't have Ukraine in NATO in any form. Our special military operation aims at demilitarization and denazification in Ukraine. All of the objectives remain in force. They're unchanged. What is changing, and precipitously so, is the size of the territory under the control of the Kiev regime. I suggest those cheering on their Ukrainian sidekicks to remember this fact, and to think not about the Zelensky posse, but rather about the interests of the Ukrainian people. Their long-term interests lie in peace and good neighborly relations with the Russian Federation. So far, our Western colleagues aren't managing to do so very well. I thank you.
Merci. Je passe la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Mr. Adedeji Ebo for his briefing, and I also listened carefully to Mr. George Zamweli. Madam President, Algeria on several occasions has warned about the predominance of escalation and confrontation in the crisis in Ukraine. We've also insisted that this kind of logic will only serve to exacerbate tensions and risks plunging the whole region into a spiral of conflict and unending crises. The situation on the ground is getting worse day by day and continues to lead to considerable losses in terms of life and great suffering amongst the populations in Ukraine and Russia. To that we must add the destruction to the civilian infrastructure, including residential buildings and hospitals and other essential structures. Moreover, the flow of weapons and munitions towards the conflict zone don't just worsen the situation, but take us further away from a possible peaceful political process that would make it possible to find a peaceful outcome to this conflict. In this regard, today, I'd like to stress the following 3 points. First of all, Algeria renews its, states again its commitment against these clashes, and we are against all non-respect for international law. Once again, we call upon the two parties to show restraint and to avoid a fresh escalation. We also call upon both parties to respect their commitments internationally and to place the protection of civilians at the heart of their priorities. The targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure is unacceptable, whatever the pretext might be. It is something that is also prohibited under international humanitarian law. Secondly, in the light of this tense situation on the ground, we reiterate our deep concern with regard to the use of deadly and destructive weapons and munitions increasingly in the conflict zone. In Ukrainian as well as in Russian territory. We also would warn against the possibility for these weapons falling into the hands of terrorist and criminal groups and extremist groups, thus helping them to reinforce their ability to carry out hostile activities, and the victims are usually civilians without defense. Thirdly, we once again urge a constructive dialogue that will leave aside geopolitical tensions and polarization. It's important that we give more space to diplomacy when it comes to this conflict, something which requires genuine willingness on the part of both parties and greater efforts to be made internationally in order to facilitate dialogue that will make it possible to find a peaceful solution to this conflict. In conclusion, Madam President, we are firmly convinced that just and lasting peace, based on the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and taking into account the legitimate security concerns of all the parties, is the key to finding a solution to this conflict and putting an end to the war. I thank you. I thank the representative of Algeria. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, President. I wish to thank Director Ebo for his briefing. We also take note of the statement by Mr. Samueli. Let me make a couple of points on behalf of my delegation. Firstly, Slovenia is concerned with the extent of destruction and human suffering caused by this war of aggression. With time and new weaponry being delivered to the battlefields, the potential for devastation is further increasing. Although the global volume of arms transfers between 2019 and 2023 has decreased in comparison to the previous 5-year period, uncontrolled and illegal arms flows continue to present challenges to peace, stability, and development across the globe. This is especially true for small arms and light weapons, where diversion presents a tangible problem, causing a cycle of violence around the world. However, right now, the cause for instability and the third development in Ukraine is unilaterally instigated invasion. A country under siege must be able to defend itself as provided by in Article 51 of the UN Charter and the international legal framework pertaining to arms transfer. We strongly reject the notion that Russia, as an aggressor in this war, can act as an advisor in which way or with which conventional arms Ukraine should defend itself. Secondly, the efforts of this Council would be much better spent addressing illegal arms transfers. For instance, the emerging evidence of missiles transferred from DPRK to Russia for use in the war on Ukraine. This is a clear violation of multiple Security Council resolutions and presents an obvious proliferation risk. We discussed the issue in detail yesterday. However, let me reiterate Slovenia's grave concern with the growing military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK. Thirdly, Slovenia is deeply concerned with the report of ballistic missiles transfer from Iran to Russia. If true, this would represent a serious development and an unacceptable act of material support to the ongoing aggression. Madam President, in conclusion, this war has ever greater consequences for the global state of peace and security. Its ramifications are felt far beyond its geography. They are global. This Council should put every effort into ending it and institute a just and durable peace for Ukraine and its people. Until then, Slovenia will continue to support Ukraine in defending its sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, I'd like to thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing. We met here in the same place yesterday to refer to the increasing cooperation between Russia and North Korea, very concerning, and the violations of international law committed by these two countries to support a brutal, illegal and unjustifiable war of aggression against a sovereign state. And I reiterate our condemnation of these serious actions. In this context, it's clear that this new meeting on the supply of Western weapons is a disinformation campaign on the part of Russia. Russia cannot blame on others the responsibility that it bears for a conflict that it chose to unleash and to pursue. Russia decided, and Russia alone, in disregard of the fundamental principles of the UN Charter, to attack Ukraine when it represented no threat to it. It ignored the order of the International Court of Justice, which ordered it on the 16th of March 2022 to immediately cease its aggression. It also ignored resolutions of the General Assembly, which condemned this aggression 7 times by an overwhelming majority, calling for respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Russia chose 1,000 days ago to prolong this conflict. It is trying to crush the resistance and unity of the Ukrainian people by multiplying violations of international humanitarian law and carrying out systematic and deliberate strikes against civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, particularly in the energy sector. Ukraine is facing a third winter with production capacity for energy destroyed by 2/3. Thousands of civilians have been killed, tens of thousands wounded, and millions of people displaced by this senseless war of aggression. The continuation of this aggression is made possible by weapons supplies coming particularly from North Korea and Iran, which is feeding the war effort. We would recall, and Russia is flouting the non-proliferation regime, but it is this that guarantees our collective security. We call upon all states to abstain from providing Russia with military equipment and dual-use goods and any components which would supply this war. Madam President, France with its partners will continue to stand alongside Ukraine as long as necessary. We provide political and military support to Ukraine so that it is able to exercise its right to legitimate defense in full conformity with Article 51 of the Charter. This right includes the possibility to strike military targets that might be involved in operations that are targeting Ukrainian territory. The capitulation of the party under attack cannot be the condition for peace negotiations which respect international law. Ukraine must be able to defend itself and be in a position, when it so decides, to open discussions with a view to establishing a just and lasting peace. This can only be on the basis of respect for the principles of the Charter and the territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to Mr. Ibo for the briefing. Let me start with a basic fact. Western support for Ukraine's self-defense is both legal and moral. Any support for Russia's act of aggression, whether by Iran, DPRK, or anyone else, is neither. Russia calls these meetings to talk up the scale and costs of Western support for Ukraine, to try to undermine public support, and to claim the West is the aggressor. But their concerns should really be closer to home. It is clear where President Putin's priorities lie. Defense and national security will consume over 40% of Russia's entire federal spending next year, a post-Soviet record high, exceeding expenditure on healthcare, education, and the environment combined. Let me repeat that. The Russian government is spending more on killing Ukrainians and trying to steal their land than it is on the health and education of its own people and the environmental protection of its own territory, all put together. It is reckless and it is self-harming. It has fueled inflation, forced interest rates up to a 20-year high, and increased dramatically the cost of government, corporate, and household borrowing. As a consequence, Russia has become poorer than all G7 and EU countries on a per capita basis, including Eastern Bloc states. The more Russian capital is funneled into defense spending, the weaker the finances of the Russian economy, which will directly harm the livelihoods and futures of Russia's own people. The costs of Russia's aggression go further. Not only is the Russian government finding it harder to recruit Russians to sacrifice their lives for its illegal war, they are also hemorrhaging human capital at home. Russian citizens are leaving Russia at a rapid rate, especially high-skilled workers. 668,000 people left Russia in 2022, causing severe labour shortages. That's in addition to the over 600,000 casualties on the battlefield in Ukraine. It's no surprise that Russian economists have predicted these labour shortages are set to continue. So Russia's out-of-control defence spending is not only wholly unjustified, it is not only a recipe for misery and suffering in Ukraine, it is not only driving global instability, it is also hugely damaging to Russia itself. We urge Russia to take a different path and to bring to an end its illegal, unprovoked, and self-harming invasion. Until then, we will continue to provide Ukraine with the support it requires to defend itself and to secure a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I extend my gratitude to Mr. Ebo for his briefing. Today's meeting is the fourth that the Security Council has held in the last 2 weeks on the situation in Ukraine. On all of the previous occasions, we heard clearly the international community's collective voice urging Russia to end its illegal invasion against Ukraine. Particularly just yesterday, the majority of Council members expressed their serious concerns over North Korea's dispatch of its military forces to Russia. Considering this, it is dismaying that Russia once again called today's meeting under the topic of weapons transfers to Ukraine, turning a deaf ear to those calls of the international community. Needless to say, the global support for Ukraine's effort to safeguard its people and territory is entirely legitimate. Frankly, it is deplorable that this august body has to address the most basic principles of international relations instead of allocating its time and energy towards tangible actions for the resolution of global challenges. In stark contrast, deepening military cooperation between Russia and North Korea clearly elucidates ongoing illegal and immoral collusion. Russia has waged this unjustifiable war at the expenses of innocent people's lives in Ukraine and is now attempting to sustain it by bringing foreign troops from a notorious pariah regime, one which consistently violates international laws and Security Council resolutions. Such violations have been repeated once again as North Korea launched an ICBM just yesterday. Furthermore, since August 2023, Russia has secured North Korea's ballistic missiles and munitions and used them against Ukraine civilians and destroy Ukraine's critical infrastructure. And now, we are about to see North Korean troops themselves on the front lines in Ukraine, putting the Ukrainian people directly in their crosshairs. The North Korean regime's inhumane nature is shown by its pursuit of this illegal deal at the risks of thousands of their young soldiers' lives. As we heard yesterday here in this chamber from those two representatives, Russia and North Korea have been reluctant to admit their weapons transfers and the dispatch of North Korean troops. All of these insidious actions indicate that both Russia and North Korea are well aware that they are doing something they want to hide, either to international community or domestic audiences. We reiterate that supporting an act of aggression which completely violates the principles of the UN Charter is illegal. We also affirm that Russia's training of North Korean soldiers involving arms or related material, and North Korean soldiers providing or receiving any related training or other assistance are in violation of a Security Council Resolution 1718, 1874, and 2270, in addition to Russia and North Korea's ongoing UN arms embargoes violations. As North Korea's direct involvement in the war in Ukraine poses serious security threats to both Europe, Northeast Asia, and beyond, international community must unequivocally and resolutely condemn this illegal military cooperation. For its part, the Republic of Korea will respond resolutely to any threats to our national security in cooperation with the international community, and will take corresponding measures depending on ensuing developments related to Russia-North Korean military cooperation. We once again urge Russia to change course as a responsible permanent member of the Security Council and end this brutal war. And the first crucial step is to return North Korean troops, as well as its own, to their homes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank the Deputy High Representative, Mr. Adechi Ebo, for his detailed briefing, and I listened carefully to Mr. Samueli. Ecuador's position in this matter is clear. The transfer of arms and munitions must be within the international legal framework that applies and relevant resolutions of the Security Council. My delegation shares the concerns once again expressed by the Deputy High Representative, particularly with regard to the risks represented by the influx of weapons and munitions. Ecuador supports these recommendations with regard to the measures necessary to mitigate these risks, and we underscore the importance of states acting responsibly with regard to every link in the chain of custody in order to prevent diversion, illicit trafficking, and the improper use of weapons. Even years after a ceasefire, the weapons that are used in a conflict can continue to affect civilians and become a factor of instability in the long term. This is the case of the utilization and dissemination of anti-personnel mines. This is an unacceptable practice which permanently threatens the civilian population and renders so much farmland unusable. Ecuador knows the negative impact of the diversion of weapons firsthand, particularly of small arms and light weapons, which frequently end up in the hands of criminal and terrorist groups, which threaten the security of the civilian population. Madam President, on various occasions in recent days, this Council has been informed of the devastating effects of that the conflict continues to impose on the civilian population. The reports confirm that many of the victims have become victims due to the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, exposing the civilian population to collateral damage as well, such as the interruption in essential services. I reiterate the urgent need for these attacks against the civilian population to cease, as well as those against civilian infrastructure, wherever they are happening, and I insist on the responsibility of the parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. As I said yesterday in this same chamber, Ecuador is concerned that if the conflict continues along this path, we could be reaching a point of no return. The increase in nuclear rhetoric and the intensification of hostilities are grounds for global concern. This is why, in conclusion, I reiterate the appeal of my delegation for a cessation of the violence and the illegal occupation, and I urge this Council to intensify its efforts to explore all avenues possible towards a peaceful, just, and lasting solution, according to the principles established in the UN Charter, international law, and resolutions of the General Assembly. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Mr. Adedeji Ebu, Director and Deputy to the High Representative of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs for his briefing. We also note the information provided by Mr. George Samuelsi. Sierra Leone takes notes of the different perspectives presented on the supply of arms with respect to the conflict in Ukraine, including those supply of weapons having the potential to prolong and escalate the level of violence in the conflict, potentially leading to a state of attrition, and those that may be in breach of Security Council resolutions. At the outset, Sierra Leone reiterates its principled position that all transfers of weapons in conflict situations should occur within the applicable international legal framework and the relevant UN Security Council resolutions, and include pre-transfer risk assessments and end-user verification to prevent diversion of arms and ammunition. Madam President, Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the continuing toll of the conflict on civilians and civilian infrastructure. The Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has verified that conflict-related violence has resulted in about 37,000 civilian casualties, including over 12,000 deaths and about 25,000 injured, since the conflict began on 24 February 2022. In September 2024 alone, over 1,400 deaths and injuries were verified, the highest number since the start of the conflict. OCHA has reported that the humanitarian situation in Ukraine worsened in August and September due to intensified attacks in the northeast, east, and south. Homes, hospitals, and schools have been damaged, in addition to the disruption of other essential services, including water and electricity. Entire neighborhoods and villages have been decimated, leaving millions displaced internally and in other countries. It is estimated that roughly 40% of Ukraine's population needs some form of humanitarian assistance. Reported attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure since March 2024 have drastically reduced the country's electricity capacity, leading to daily power cuts for millions of people across Ukraine. These outages, often lasting many hours, limit access to water, mobile networks, and internet and public transportation. Damage to energy infrastructure is expected to exacerbate the challenges civilians will face in the coming winter, which is forecasted to be the toughest for Ukrainians since February 2022. We are deeply concerned over this development as Ukraine approaches its third winter since the start of the conflict in February 2022. The alarming civilian casualties and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, as verified by HRMMU and OCHA, underscores the urgent need for all parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from further escalation and pursuit of the option of winning the war on the battlefield at all costs. The impact of this conflict also includes adverse effects on the global economy, development, and environment. Prices of wheat, maize, edible oils, and fertilizers have risen exponentially over the past 3 years from reduced agricultural production and disruptions in supply chain, including reduced activities in major ports and other means of transportation in Ukraine. UNEP also estimates that the conflict has resulted in increased release of toxic materials into the air, including greenhouse gas emissions, damaged ecosystem and biodiversity loss, soil pollution, and landmine contamination. Madam President, it is clear that a military solution to the conflict is not feasible. The international community, including this Council, must therefore remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting dialogue and diplomacy as the primary tools for de-escalating tensions and paving the way for a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine. Sierra Leone once more calls for good faith diplomatic efforts in pursuit of a peaceful resolution involving the parties to the conflict. Meaningful steps must be taken towards the immediate de-escalation and cessation of hostilities. We urge the parties to the conflict to engage constructively, including on their legitimate concern, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. In closing, Sierra Leone calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity within internationally recognized borders, and genuine diplomatic efforts to achieve a peaceful and lasting resolution to the conflict, taking into account the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Mr. Ebo and Mr. Samueli for their briefings. The Ukraine crisis has dragged on with no sign of the end of the fighting for now, as all kinds of weapons and ammunition keep flowing in with widening variety and scope. The battlefield has become a show of weapons. The Council has considered the issue of providing weapons to Ukraine many times, and many Council members, including China, have expressed concerns about the increased lethality of the weapons and the rising risk of diversion and proliferation. I would like to reiterate that weapons may help win wars, but they cannot win lasting peace. The continued supply of weapons to the battlefield will only exacerbate the cruelty, danger, and unpredictability of the war, hasten the spread of the crisis spillover effects, and further dim the hopes for the cessation of hostilities. China believes that the pressing priority of the moment is to follow the three principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of the fighting, and no provocation by any party, and work to de-escalate the situation and resolve the crisis politically as soon as possible. We call on the parties to conflict to demonstrate in earnest their political will, start peace talks, and stop fighting sooner than later, and call on the international community to actively create favorable conditions and provide constructive assistance to this end. President, if I'm not mistaken, the representative of the U.S. will, as on previous occasions, discredit and vilify China and play the blame game on Ukraine issue. At previous meetings, I responded to these accusations. Today, I might as well take the offensive and say a few things about the U.S. first. First, the Ukraine crisis is essentially an eruption of the built-up security tensions in Europe, a result of the long-term accumulation and worsening of the security deficit and trust deficit in Europe. And it is precisely the U.S. that is constantly exacerbating security tension, widening the trust deficit and creating division and confrontation in Europe. Second, after the outbreak of the war, in the face of an increasingly severe humanitarian crisis and spillover effects, most countries in the world have called for an early resumption of peace talks and a ceasefire to end the war. It is precisely the U.S. that keeps sending weapons to the battlefield and openly calls it an opportunity to weaken and defeat Russia and blatantly advance its own geopolitical agenda. Third, at present, the international community is calling for cooperation rather than division, and the resolution of the Ukraine crisis requires dialogue rather than confrontation. It is precisely the U.S. that has repeatedly discredited China's peace efforts, constantly ties China to Russia, drives a wedge in relations between China and Europe, and deliberately creates bloc confrontation. We have some advice for the U.S. Peddling anxiety, fabricating enemies, and stoking confrontation will not only bring disputes and chaos to the world, but will also hurt the U.S. itself in the end. We hope that the U.S. can stop its pointless blame game and work with the countries concerned, including China, to make tangible contribution to the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis instead of obstructing the international community's efforts for peace. In closing, if the representative of the U.S. uncharacteristically doesn't make accusations against China in his statement later on, I'd like to apologize to him in advance. Thank you, Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President, and I also thank Director Ebo for his briefing. I have also taken note of the views expressed by Mr. Samueli. We regret to see that the Russian Federation persists in using the Council's time and resources to express its dissatisfaction with how the victim, Ukraine, is defending itself against this aggression. Requests for such meetings are nothing more than futile attempts to try to justify the unjustifiable. The facts are clear. Through its decision to invade Ukraine on 24 February 2022, the Russian Federation took a conscious decision to violate the UN Charter and international law, while exploiting its permanent seat on the Security Council. Neither can we forget that the Russian Federation has also procured weapons and ammunition from Iran and DPRK, some of which in violation of Security Council resolutions, and just received 12,000 soldiers from the DPRK. Madam President, as we approach the 1,000-day mark from the start of this conflict, it is important that this Council continues to take stock of the devastating impact this illegal war has had on Ukraine. The relentless bombing of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, ports, and the intensity of missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities in recent months has continued to exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. Unfortunately, the reprehensible loss of life and suffering since the start of this war is on the increase. We also condemn the systematic attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which have reduced Ukraine's energy production capacity and put additional pressure as we approach the winter months. Malta continues to call for full and unfettered access for all humanitarian workers currently operating on the ground. We are deeply concerned over the incidents of violence against humanitarian workers in the vicinity of the front line. Malta reiterates that international humanitarian law and international human rights law must be fully adhered to by all parties at all times. We stressed the need for full accountability for all crimes committed by Russia and Ukraine. We reaffirm our support to the ongoing work of the ICC, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and the Register of Damage. We also reiterate our support for the establishment of a special tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. In closing, Madam President, let me reiterate that Ukraine has a right to defend itself under Article 51 of the UN Charter. We once again call on the Russian Federation to immediately end the war it started and withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Malta for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, I would like firstly to thank Director Dedece Ebo and Mr. Samuel for their comprehensive briefings. In yesterday's session, we emphasized that any attempt to resolve this conflict through further military escalation pose a serious threat to international peace and security. Such actions not only intensify an already severe conflict, but fundamentally undermine global disarmament goals. The implications for international stability are far too consequential to disregard. Mozambique has consistently affirmed the right of states to self-defense as enshrined in international law. However, the continuous provision of arms, such as long-range systems, advanced combat platforms, high-caliber artillery, missiles, and uncrewed aerial vehicles, fuels further tensions. We must recognize this fundamental truth that when nations prioritize armament, diplomatic solutions become increasingly elusive. Madam President, as previously articulated, historical precedent clearly demonstrates the profound dangers associated with uncontrolled arms proliferations. The current absence of post-shipment verification protocols, robust tracking, and end-use monitoring exacerbates these risks, creating vulnerabilities that malevolent actors may exploit. The situation in Ukraine presents no exception. The transferred weapons in the present context risk emerging in future black markets, including in Africa, thereby potentially fueling illicit arms trade that endangers civilian populations and regional stability. This destructive cycle demands our immediate action. In this context, we underscore the critical importance of the UN disarmament framework and the binding obligations outlined in the international instruments, including the Arms Trade Treaty, which mandates stringent controls on arms transfers to prevent unintended consequences. Madam President, the humanitarian implications remain profoundly disturbing. Civilian casualties in Ukraine remain unacceptably high, with a significant portion of injuries resulting from explosive weaponry. We must emphasize that international humanitarian law, particularly regarding the protection of civilian and civilian infrastructure, requires universal adherence and respect. Recalling our previous appeals, we strongly urge this Council to spearhead a strategic shift from sustaining military engagement to creating conditions conducive to peace. Such a course correction would substantially reinforce global confidence in this Council's mandate to safeguard international peace and security. To conclude, Madam President, we call upon this Council to elevate diplomatic initiatives above armament considerations to prevent an irreversible escalation with dire consequence for Ukraine and beyond. Let us channel our collective efforts toward genuine peace-building initiatives. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant du
I thank the representative of Mozambique. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. And I also thank Deputy to the High Representative Mr. Adedeji Ebo and other briefers for their briefings. Russia has repeatedly claimed that the so-called transfer of Western arms to Ukraine prolongs the war of aggression that Russia itself has started. No reasonable person would believe such a distorted narrative. Rather, the focus should clearly be on military aid, which Russia is seeking for. Specifically, the advancement of military cooperation between Russia and North Korea is extremely alarming as it leads to further deterioration in the situation in Ukraine, and North Korea will likely gain something in return. We have repeatedly condemned in the strongest terms Russia's procurement of ballistic missiles from North Korea to use against Ukraine. As we stated yesterday, North Korea's dispatchment of its soldiers to Russia and their engagement in military training constitutes a blatant violation of relevant Security Council resolutions. We continue to closely monitor this development with serious concern, including the imminent risk that these troops may take direct part in Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which would constitute a grave violation of international law, including UN Charter. In addition, we reiterate our deep concern about Iran's transfer of ballistic missiles to Russia. These are the issues of the Security Council should be focusing on. These are the issues the Security Council should be focusing on. Any act of support for Russia's violation of the UN Charter is unacceptable. On the contrary, the support provided to Ukraine by the international community is both legitimate and legal. Russia's claim is clearly an attempt to mislead the international community. Madam President, some members have suggested that all parties should show restraint. However, this is completely misguided in such a clear-cut case. We would like to reiterate that any call for peace that does not affirm the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine is not in line with this UN Charter. That is unjust and not sustainable. The international community must reject such a pseudo peace. In conclusion, Madam President, we reiterate our strongest demand that Russia immediately and unconditionally withdraw from Ukraine and reaffirm our commitment to continue supporting Ukraine. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Japon et je passe la parole.
I thank the representative of Japan. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Ebo, for your briefing. After 980 days of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, in violation of the UN Charter, with all the death and destruction Russia has caused, Russia is today falsely trying to blame others for its war and for Putin's obstinance. Russia started this war. Russia could end it tomorrow. Until it does, Ukraine has an inherent right to defend itself, and the international community can and must ensure Ukraine's borders are not redrawn by force. As I've said many times, Russia's disinformation fools no one. The real issue is not international support for Ukraine's defense. Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine is the victim. For Russia, war means conquest. For Ukraine, survival. The issue today is Russia's unlawful aggression against Ukraine and the countries that are dangerously fueling it. It is not hard to miss the irony of Russia calling this meeting just as 10,000 soldiers from the DPRK deploy in Russia to train and potentially join Russian forces against Ukraine. We heard yesterday the international community's serious concerns Russia may be planning to use DPRK soldiers against Ukrainian forces. we caution Russia not to make such a dangerous miscalculation. DPRK participation in combat against Ukraine would be an alarming expansion of the conflict. Already, the DPRK's troop deployment in Russia marks a dangerous expansion in Russian DPRK ties. We note that in March, Russia vetoed the mandate renewal of the UN panel of experts on the DPRK. For 15 years, the panel of experts monitored compliance with DPRK-related UN Security Council resolutions, which all remain in effect. Last week, the Duma ratified Russia and the DPRK's mutual defense agreement, while the DPRK has unlawfully supplied ballistic missiles, launchers, and ammunition to support Russia's war of aggression. Russia's actions with respect to the DPRK are not only dangerous, but they are antithetical to its responsibility as a permanent member of this UN Security Council. Russia's military cooperation with the DPRK violates multiple UN Security Council resolutions, which prohibit both procuring DPRK arms and providing military training. Specifically, Russia's training of DPRK soldiers involving arms or related materiel violates UN Security Council resolutions 1718, 1874, and 2270. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the path the Kremlin is taking with the DPRK. Moscow has shown the same contempt for this institution when it violated other UN Security Council resolutions by deepening military ties with Tehran. Iran has supplied the Kremlin with armed drones as well as close-range ballistic missiles, undermining the security of Europe as well as the Middle East. Meanwhile, China continues to downplay its large-scale support for Russia's defense industrial base, providing materials key to Russia's defense production, including weapons components, UAV and cruise missile technology, machine tools, microelectronics, and nitrocellulose. PRC-based companies have even collaborated with Russian defense firms to design and produce long-range attack drones. China cannot credibly claim to be a voice for peace when it enables Russia to wage the largest war in Europe in decades. China's support to Russia is decisive. China's support is prolonging the war. China talks about creating conditions for peace. But China could quickly create those conditions by suspending the support to Russia. And I want to be clear. It is not our intention to vilify or smear China. These are facts. China is providing materials key to Russia's defense production, including, as I said, weapons components, UAV and cruise missile technology, machine tools, microelectronics, and nitrocellulose. I repeat that because it's important. And as I said, PRC-based companies have collaborated with Russian defense firms to design and produce long-range attack drones. These are critical facts, worth repeating. As 141 countries condemned Russia's invasion and its violation of the UN Charter, as 141 countries called on Russia to withdraw its forces and bring peace, China abstained. Even now, China's voice could help end the war by calling on Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. And as I've said previously, the U.S. delegation will continue to call out those countries, including China, that provide support to Russia's defense industrial base. My calls will not end until that support ceases. Lastly, Madam President, we again call on Russia to end this war and immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine's international recognized territory, to cease its procurement of DPRK and Iranian materiel, and to meet its responsibilities as a member of the Security Council. And let me be clear, even with the addition of DPRK troops, Russian forces will not prevail in Ukraine. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Mr. Ibo for his brief this morning and take note of the information provided by Mr. Zamouli. Guyana shares the concern expressed by Mr. Ibo about the risk of diversion and proliferation of arms and ammunition transferred into this or any armed conflict. We note that much of the risk will remain even after the fighting has ended and underscore the need for all involved to ensure that arms transfers comply with relevant disarmament instruments and UN Security Council resolutions. They must also have robust provisions and controls to prevent their diversion. We also took note of the fact that the supply of weapons and ammunition into an armed conflict has the potential to further escalate or prolong the violence. The only effective means of preventing a further escalation or instability in Ukraine and the broader region is to end this war. Its prolongation poses increasingly grave risks and consequences not only to the parties directly involved, but also for the countries in the region and for global peace and security. The scale of the current humanitarian needs in Ukraine remains quite vast and will only increase further in the coming winter months. 14.6 million people are in need, with almost 4 million internally displaced and over 6 million living as refugees in Europe. Yesterday, OCHA reported that the humanitarian situation in the country has worsened since August, due to intensified attacks in the northeast, east, and southern regions. Meanwhile, the 2024 humanitarian appeal has received less than half of the requested $3.1 billion. And response efforts face growing challenges, including safety risks. Guyana calls upon the international community to scale up support for the humanitarian response. We also call on the parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international law and minimize civilian harm, to grant unhindered humanitarian access to all persons in need, and to ensure the safety and protection of humanitarian workers. We also urge them to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict peacefully and with full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. It is time to end the hostilities and deploy resources to rebuild the lives of the millions of people affected. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana, and now I would like to make a statement in my quality as representative of Switzerland.
Like colleagues before me, I'd like to thank the Deputy High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Ibo. Switzerland continues to staunchly condemn the flagrant violation of international law, including of the UN Charter, which is what Russia's military aggression constitutes. We reiterate that Russia's actions violate the prohibition on the use of force, in addition to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. There is no justification for them. It is high time to act so as to restore respect for the UN Charter. Therefore, we'd like to once again call on Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and to withdraw its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine. Switzerland remains deeply concerned about the impact of this war on the civilian population. We remind all parties of their strict obligation, which binds them to respect international humanitarian law and human rights. The latest report issued by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, it was published this week, in fact, provides a devastating account with new findings concerning torture, sexual violence, attacks using explosive weapons, all of which affected civilians and civilian objects, as well as attacks on energy-related infrastructure. We'd like to note that the Commission concluded that it has sufficient evidence to determine that the Russian authorities committed crimes against humanity, the crime of torture specifically. Switzerland strongly supports the work of the Commission and its recommendations. We urge Russia to comply with these recommendations without delay, as well as to cooperate fully with all international monitoring and investigative bodies. Excellencies, Switzerland has expressed its position on the topic at hand on numerous occasions. First, we reaffirm that Ukraine has the right to ensure its security as well as to defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty. Second, we express our deep dismay over the apparent continuation and the intensification of external support for Russia's military aggression. I'm referring to yesterday's Council meeting, which addressed the alleged deployment of troops from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to Russia, as well as the position of Switzerland stated on that occasion. Third, we echo the call of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, calling for compliance with the applicable international legal framework, including relevant Security Council resolutions, and to apply these when transferring arms and munitions. We urge all states to respect their legal obligations as well as to shoulder their political responsibilities. By way of conclusion, I'd like to highlight Switzerland's ongoing commitment to supporting efforts aimed at achieving a just and lasting peace in Ukraine on the basis of the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. This commitment goes hand in hand with our support for accountability efforts, in particular, those geared towards bringing the perpetrators of international crimes to justice, for there can be no peace in Ukraine without justice. I thank you.
I resume my functions as President of the Council. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement. Before I give you the floor, I would recall to members of the Council what has been so important to Switzerland during our presidency and which is important for us during this last debate on the last day of our presidency, and that is to say that this council is a place of respect, and therefore I invite all speakers to participate in an appropriate tone and appropriate words when they make their remarks. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I would like to make some brief response. China has not provided weapons to any party related to the conflict in Ukraine, and China has strictly managed dual-use items according to WTO rules and market rules. Together with Russia, Ukraine, and other countries, China has conducted normal economic and trade cooperation. This is legal, and there is nothing to blame. We oppose the U.S. practice to smear China on the question of Ukraine and to conduct long-arm jurisdiction and sanction Chinese companies and entities on this question. We will defend the legitimate rights of Chinese individuals and entities. In addition, I want to say that since the beginning of the war, China has called for cessation of hostilities, launching of negotiations, and restoration of peace. Over the past 3 years or so, China has been working very hard and appeal in this regard. Who is obstructing peace and who is supporting peace? This is clear to the eyes of the international community. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm not going to respond to my Chinese colleague. I think I've been very clear. We just received some information just coming in minutes ago that indicates that there are right now 8,000 DPRK soldiers in Kursk Oblast. And I have a very respectful question for my Russian colleague. Does Russia still maintain that there are no DPRK troops in Russia? That's my only question and my final point. Thank you.